Good morning. Um, I'm trying to figure out there's a new interface for the software I'm using to stream, and it's kind of it's kind of new. It's something I'll need to get used to. So, um, good morning, good afternoon, happy Friday. As I record this, it's Friday. I usually do these on Friday. Sometimes I do them on another day, but Friday seems to work well for me, Friday morning. And it is coffee hour for me. So, very good morning to you. You're always the first on, and I appreciate it, and I appreciate you as well. Um, See, it's really weird. I'm trying to work the controls here, and I apologize. I am I'm not used to that. They changed the controls on the interface, so everything's in a different place now, and I'll figure it out. I promise. I'll get better. I'll get better. It's like I just learned how to use this interface, and now you know, it's changed up on me, but that's okay. Um, I'll figure it out and we'll get working. So, it's June. As I record this, it's June 9th. If you're not joining live, you're watching this some other later time. It's June 9th. And oh my gosh, somebody's calling me. This is gonna seem weird. I'm sorry, but I have to take this. I think it's my roofer. So be patient with me for just a minute. Hello? Hello? Yes, I can. Yes, yeah. Yep, sounds great. Eh, yeah, that's fine. I'm here. Okay. All right. Thank you. Okay. Bye. Sorry about that. That's probably the weirdest thing that's ever happened in one of these. Yeah, I have some roof repairs being done, and so I needed to talk to the person because he was telling me that the guys are showing up today to do that. So apologies. Anyway, it's June, and June around the world is Pride Month. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And I decided as the talk today that I'm going to talk about something that's really important to me. And that's something that I call sex positive spirituality. And I'm going to go into that. I'm going to go into what I mean by that. I'm going to go into why I think that's important. Feel free to comment or chat, and we'll chat about these things. But I will start out by saying that it's an important part of my personal spiritual mission, I guess, for lack of a better term, to provide space, to provide uh, a safety for people to be who they really are, to express who they really are. As Crowley wrote in the Book of the Law, every man and every woman is a star. And I think, far be it to me to interpret those words like too deeply, but I think what we mean by that is everybody is this divine spirit. Everybody has this divine spark. Every one of us is a projection of divinity. We're a star. And it is our mission to find ourselves, to find who we really are and live that out, right? If we don't finish that in this lifetime, we got to come back and do it all over again. That's my viewpoint. So for me, it is really, really important that I help students, clients, friends, family, whoever, just to express who they are, to be who they are. Um, uh, whatever that is. And there's a lot of backlash right now, particularly in the United States, against the LGBTQ plus community. I think that's really unfortunate. I think one of the ideals of the United States is basically to each their own. Allow people to live as they see fit, to have freedom of choice. that sort of thing. Um, but let me I'm gonna go into that quite a bit, and I'm gonna talk about what I mean by sex positivity. It's not just that, "Oh, I think sex is great." Sex is great, it's a great thing, there are lots of reasons for that, not just because it feels good and we do it, but it can be a very, potent aspect of your spiritual experience. As as, beings on this earth, particularly mammals, particularly primates, we have uh, a very strong drive, and it is not just procreative. It's not. There's a study that came out yesterday, um, and there was no conclusion to this study, or it didn't come out yesterday. I read a report about it yesterday, and they were like, why do primates, so humans, monkeys, chimps, bonobos, whatever, why do they masturbate so much? Right? Like, they're trying to figure it out. What's the purpose? It doesn't serve an evolutionary purpose, but it's been observed particularly in primates. Um, and why is that a thing? I'll talk about that a little bit, not just that particular topic, but why do we have this um why do we have this drive? And I do think that it is a spiritual evolutionary drive. I do think that when we express ourselves that way, when we express ourselves through sexual energy, it is about spiritual evolution, or it can be. It can be. There can be some, obviously, um, obviously there can be very shallow or victimizing or whatever experiences, and those are not what I'm talking about. So let me get into a little bit, and I always try to define my terms so at least you know what I think I'm talking about, not because my definitions need to replace anybody else's, or you need to adopt my definitions of things, just so that um, when I say use a term like sex positivity, what do I mean by that? So, um, sex positivity for me means that any consensual, and consent is the key, and I'm going to talk a lot about consent today. Any consensual sexual activity is perfectly fine, period, right? It has to be consensual, meaning it has to be between adults, basically, right? It has to be between people who have consented, agreed to the interaction. Um, it has to be between people who are conscious, people who are unconscious, people who are intoxicated, don't have the capacity to consent, right? So there's a really great, and I'm going to focus a lot on consent because it is absolutely critical, right? Some people might believe that sex positivity means like anything goes, and in general, it's fine with the caveat of consent. So there's a really great analogy, and I don't know who came up with it. Someday, maybe I'll find out and I will reference them. But I don't know who came up with this, but I think it's great, so I'm going to share it. So, to explain consent and how consent works, and not that people on here don't understand how consent works, but to explain it, one great analogy is tea, serving tea to somebody. You can offer tea to somebody, and they can refuse. They can say, I don't want tea right now." And that's fine. You can't force somebody to drink tea. You can, um, somebody can agree to drink tea and then change their mind. Even while they're drinking it, they can change their mind, and you can't force them to finish the cup of tea. You can't pour tea down the throat of somebody who's unconscious, right? So this to me was kind of a useful model for thinking about consent, thinking about sexual consent. Personally, I think that we should be teaching age appropriate lessons about consent very early and very often. They should be repeated, to both boys and girls, um, why, whether through schooling or through parents talking to them about that. I have talked to my daughters a lot about that. Um, I went to school. It was, I think, first grade. A boy was pinching my daughter's butt in music class or something like that. And I went to school and I said, "Look, I don't, you know, this child who's doing this needs to be pulled aside, and like, we're not going to go overboard with this, but needs to pull this child aside and tell them they can't violate somebody else's body like that." And that is, it's a first grader, but still, like, you can't let that go. You have to catch that behavior. It's not okay. And you have to teach this child it's not okay. I didn't want the child in trouble or, whatever, but and they're like, "Well, we had the talk at the beginning of the year about good touch and bad touch and that sort of thing." And I said, "It's fine, but obviously that lesson needs to be repeated, right?" And my daughter didn't want to tell on this kid and all this stuff. There's all this pressure, and I just think, like, that creates letting that ride creates this situation. So I think we need to teach children about consent, going forward. So that's a little bit about consent. I'll probably talk about that more as I go on. It's something I harp on quite a bit, because it's incredibly important. It's critical. It's crucial. So sex positivity means any consensual activity between adults is totally fine. It's great. You know, it doesn't mean I have to do that or you have to do that or whatever, but it means we don't judge, we don't shame, we don't try to outlaw, we don't try to take people's rights away, we don't try to, tell people they're going to burn in hell. We don't do that. Um, the other aspect of this, of sex positivity, for me, because it covers the spectrum of quote unquote activity, there's also the idea of identity, right? And that people should have the right to express themselves how however they see fit, in my opinion. I have friends and clients and people I know who are transgender, for example, and that's become a big hot button topic in the United States in particular. There are people trying to outlaw drag shows and all this stuff. Drag shows have been around for thousands of years. Thousands. Technically, Shakespeare plays were drag shows because all of the parts were played by men, including, Romeo and Juliet. Juliet was played by a young boy. Ronald Reagan, conservative superhero, Ronald Reagan played drag in a movie, in an army recruitment movie during World War II. And all of a sudden it has become a threat. We need to scare some people that people are doing bad things so that we can um, distract them and we can get power and we can go we need to have a common enemy that we can go after. It's just insanity from my perspective, but it means that all expressions of gender are also valid. Let's talk about gender for a minute. There's a lot of arguments. There are only two genders, or there are only two sexes. Sex and gender are the same thing. Sex is biological, and there are more than two biological sexes. There are people who are intersex. There are people who are born with both sets of reproductive organs, or different genetics, and that's while it's not common, it is real. It's a realistic thing. Gender is a social cultural construct, and I can prove that right now, right? In that gender roles, the things, like, even in Western culture where we're like men are men or women are women for the most part of our history, Those roles have changed significantly in a very short period of time. Humans have been around maybe about a million years, modern humans, maybe less, somewhere between 300,000 and a million years. I don't know what the current dating is of modern human beings. Um, the you know, so look at 200 years of history is a drop in the bucket, you know, less than a thousandth of human history. Look at how the roles in any place in the world, uh, the gender roles have changed significantly, right? Um, when I grew up, when I was young, many years ago, there women were just sort of starting to enter the workforce. I would say married women. I was the first kind of generation of what they called latchkey kids, where we came home and we had a key. We let ourselves in after school, right? Before that, in general, women didn't work, particularly married women. Married women for a long time in the United States had to get their husband's permission to open a credit card. Women were not allowed to vote until 1919, something 19. I think it's 1919, maybe 1916, 1916. Anyway, around then, the poem "First They Came." I'm not familiar with that one, but oh, first they came for so and so, and then I didn't say anything. That poem, yeah. Yes, 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 yes. I didn't do anything because I'm not a socialist. Right, exactly. Exactly correct. So if they can say, I'm coming for these people because they're different than I am, how at what point do people come for me because I'm different than they are? Right. Um, yes, yes. Very good point. But in this country, so my grandmother passed away in February. She was 106 years old, true matriarch. Was born in 1906 in the town of Bath, Maine. And when I think about her lifespan, um, and the changes that culture has gone through, when she was born, women couldn't vote in the United States legally. Women were not considered full citizens, nor were Native Americans, nor were African Americans. I mean, prior to, not that long before that, um, most African Americans were enslaved people. This culture has changed. It's changed significantly in respect. When my mother went to school as a child, she was required, this was public school, not even a religious school. She was required to wear a skirt. It could be, 20 below outside. She was required to wear a skirt to school. Girls were not allowed to wear pants. And when they came in to school, they were forced to kneel by the wall to make sure that their skirt touched the floor below their knees. Can you imagine trying to do that in a public school today? Line all the girls up and make them kneel against the wall. Um, Although there's still some places that have very sexist dress codes. I know, I was there's some stuff with my daughter's school early on where there was a real double standard around boys and girls and how they could dress in school. you know, um, because apparently in our culture these days, girls' shoulders are considered, you know, uh, private parts or something. Like you can't show your shoulders in school because we can't control what boys will do or something. And I'll talk about that in a moment, as well. But so gender roles have changed significantly over time in a single culture. If you expand your view into gender out into different cultures, then you'll see very different ideas. So we have, like ultra conservative cultures, say in the Middle East, where, um, women are basically have no rights. They can't uncover their hair or their face in public. They can't drive. They can't go out of the house on their own without a male relative with them, stuff like that in some places in the world. We don't do that here. But there are other cultures, particularly indigenous cultures, that recognize more than two genders. In many Native American cultures, they recognize what the term that's most commonly used is two spirit. A person who is two spirited is considered to have both a male and a female spirit. We might refer to them as non-binary. Um, in sort of outward expression, they might combine masculine and feminine, stereotypical masculine and feminine looks. Um, but they're considered special. They're considered holy, sacred people. And the same is true in some places in India and some cultures, some Hindu cultures are like that as well. Um, in early alchemy, the the hermaphrodite, the mixture of male and female was considered sacred. One of the ultimate goals of early alchemy was to merge the masculine and feminine sides within you. Of course, they're talking about the divine masculine and divine feminine. I've done some talks on that. I'll probably do some more. It's a topic that I'm particularly interested in. Um, so for me, sex positive spirituality includes accepting people of what we would call, they used to call it lifestyle. Oh, that person lives an alternate lifestyle. It's not a lifestyle, they're just living their life. um, Accepting people of all orientations, of all expressions of sexuality, meaning there are people who are in traditional heterosexual monogamous relationships. That's fantastic. There are people who are ethically non monogamous, and that's fantastic. There are people who are in same sex relationships. There are people who are in thruples. You know, we are accepting of these people. They're exploring their own personal um sexuality, and that's a good thing. It's when we are repressive, when we repress parts of ourselves because they're not acceptable to culture, or they're not acceptable to our family, or they're not acceptable to our education system, or we feel threatened. um and I can't begin to understand um you know my life being at risk, or my rights being at risk, just because of who I am. But that's what a lot of people go through all the time. I'll never forget, one of the most touching moments in my life was a dear friend many years ago came out to me as gay. Now, I knew he was gay for a long time. Um, but he had never, like, openly declared, said it to me, and he wasn't out to me. He wasn't out to everyone. He was, you know, and at first I was like, well, yeah, I'm not surprised. I don't know why it took you so long to tell me. But when I thought about it, when I talked to him, when I, had conversations with people, I'm like, "Ah, I do get why sometimes it takes people such a long time to come out, or it certainly did. um and that's a thing. I don't know if that's even so much of a thing anymore. I guess it is. But it was a much bigger thing back then, a couple decades ago, because um he didn't know if I was going to accept him. He was a good friend, or he still is a good friend. But at the time, we've been friends for a number of years, and the friendship was important, and he didn't know. Uh which seems weird. I'm like, "Don't you know me well enough to know that I would accept you no matter what you said to me?" Um, but it's not about that. It's about this fear that he had of being rejected. And I like that I can understand, even if, many people in that age and even today coming out means they're rejected from their family or they may be rejected from certain friends or whatever. That's painful stuff, and I don't know why we decide we need to make people go through that. you know um it's not kind, it's not compassionate, it's not empathetic. Compassion and empathy are strengths. So um anyway, from a spiritual aspect, it can be difficult to talk about this because for so long, thousands of years, spirituality has meant religion. And religion often has dogma about sex. What's okay, what's not okay, that sort of thing. And again, like that dogma is different depending upon your religion, right? Um, and is expressed differently. We have, talking about sex in particular, everybody's familiar with the quote unquote missionary position, right? You know, the sort of vanilla sex, and where that comes from, where that terms comes from, is these missionaries, these religious missionaries would go out to, the jungles of South America or Africa or whatever, and people were, having all kinds of sexual activity and sexual positions and whatever. And these missionaries were shocked and were like, no, 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 no. This is the only way that's okay. Like, this is the way that God said is the only way that you can have sex that's okay. There's nothing about that anywhere in any holy text, in any sacred text. There's no, it's really such a weird thing to me, but it was completely made up, as are most rules like that. Um, Completely made up. It doesn't come from scripture or text or anything. And then if you look at some other non-Western systems, sexuality is highly integrated into the spiritual practices. Of course, a lot of people know about tantra from the Vedics of India. And there's this sort of like really westernized brand of tantra, which is really about using sexual energy yogically for yoga practice, for enlightenment, whatever. um and it's great, it's fine. I don't think like it really if you look up tantra in India, it's very different. um you have folks like the agoras who um live in charnel grounds and eat rotten flesh and like just they're really, really different system. Not to say that there's anything wrong with any particular system. I think tantric practices for cultivating sexual energy for spiritual use are fantastic. Good physically, good mentally, good spiritually. Again, along as long as it doesn't become you have sexual activity can become harmful when it's obviously I talked about consent, but also when it becomes addictive. Addictive behaviors mean you don't have control over them. And um you know sex releases really, it feels good physically, but emotionally, the chemicals that it releases, you're releasing opiates into your system, endogenous opiates and, endorphins and, releasing stress from your nervous system and doing all kinds of things. So, um, dopamine, most, maybe all, but most addiction pathways involve the chemical dopamine, right? Dopamine is our reward chemical. So most addictive activities release dopamine. and we crave dopamine, so that we can become addicted to not just drugs, addictive substances, but we can become addicted to sexual activity. We can become addicted to work. We can become addicted to food. We can become addicted to shopping, to gambling, to anything that is rewarding. We can become addicted to. So it's a good thought to keep an eye on those things to make sure activity is not becoming problematic. Um, so let's talk about boys and girls for a moment. And I just I'm not just talking gender identity, but the way that we treat the genders in at least the culture I live in, and probably other cultures. But I talked a little bit about, dress codes that drove me crazy when my girls were younger. They had, they could wear something to school, but the width of the shoulder had to be at least 3 finger widths. And I'm like, whose fingers? Who are they measuring this by? Why? Why is like, if they have something with a thin strap on their shoulder as opposed to something wider, like what's going on there? Like I don't like it was completely confusing to me. And the argument has always been since I remember that it's distracting. It's dress is about. Now I'm not saying that kids should go to school in their underwear or that um showing off private parts in school is okay or whatever. I'm not saying that. But what I'm saying is there's this disparity between, at least in my experience, between girls and boys dress codes in school. And it seems to be focused on this idea that boys cannot control themselves, that they are, when girls are around, if they're showing their shoulder, that boys are not going to be able to focus in school, and therefore girls have to control what they're wearing. Oh, for having a shoulder showing. Yeah, it's interesting. I went to a military base one time in the Philippines, and we drove in. A bunch of us drove in. We were in a van, and they sent the guard out to inspect us. And I'm like, oh, they're checking us for weapons or whatever. And what they were checking us for, and this was for everybody, not just women, but nobody was allowed to wear a tank top. You couldn't show shoulders on the military base. It's really interesting. Oh, late good morning to you as well. Yeah, I know. If you're working, obviously don't don't watch and work. But there is always the replay. These are always recorded and available online, both on Facebook and YouTube and as well as Twitch, I believe. Um, Yeah, so, military base, they're, in the Philippines, they came out and the guard came in the van, it was, like, checking everybody out, and they're like, "Yeah, nobody's allowed to wear a tank top on this base, show their shoulders." So, it's interesting, but yeah, so there's this idea then there's this weird idea that we do with boys and girls and that we have done, and it was much more amplified when I was younger, but it still exists to some extent that boys cannot control themselves, the whole boys will be boys argument. Boys cannot control their sexual desires, and so it's up to girls to dress modestly or whatever. It's up to girls to control boys' behavior, something along those lines, right? Which on its surface, if you just call it out and say it that way, it sounds really stupid because it is. It's very stupid. It's insulting to boys, right? We're assuming that boys are just these animals with who cannot learn self-control, who can't, control their impulses, even in school. Um, and one of the things that I found in life in general is that very often people behave in the ways that we expect them to behave. You treat somebody like a, you know, like they can't control themselves and they're going to act out of control. Heard anything about people opposing them in general, except the drag shows for children? Yeah, I mean, the drag shows for children are they're not going to have sexual content in them. It's going to be a guy in a dress reading to kids. And I grew up with Bugs Bunny. Bugs Bunny was put on a dress very often, and there was Dame Edna, and there were all kinds of drag stuff growing up as a kid. A lot of comedy, British comedies, Monty Python, lots of drag in that. Not to say that Monty Python's always appropriate for children either. But it's artificial. It's constructed. It's a distraction from other things. There's always a monetary aspect to it. There's always somebody who's doing something to raise funds or to sell something, or whatever. But there is a difference between drag shows that are geared towards adults, which can be very bawdy. They're rooted in sort of like vaudeville performance and that sort of thing. And these kinds of shows where they're having like drag story hour, or whatever. The behavior, the language, that all of these things are very, very different. Um, uh, I think much more has been made out of it than there are lots of things being said about it that just aren't true. Um, so regardless, lost my train of thought, but that's fairly typical. I'm pretty neuroatypical. I like to say neurospicy, so I can lose my train of thought fairly easily. Speaking on tangents. So I was talking about this dress code, this idea that we have that boys and girls are, boys are different culturally growing up. You know, Girls, and this may be changing. It's changed significantly since I was young, but girls were supposed to be virgins until they were married. Guys were supposed to go out and have lots of sexual experience with lots of girls. How does that work? How does that work? If guys are supposed to quote unquote score, like we use the language from sports, right? Guys are supposed to score with all of these girls to prove their masculinity, right? To be masculine, one has to have all of these sexual experiences with girls who are being told, if you have sex, you're a slut. We slut shame um girls for liking sex, for wanting sex. So I just remember it was this whole weird thing growing up and discovering that, oh, girls really like sex too. I thought, I was always taught that, like, you know, it was all about guys, that sort of thing. What a weird thing. The culture has set up this competition between men and women, between boys and girls. Um, not even talking about just talking about straight boys and girls, or um, yeah, pretty much these relationships are really weird that we have built culturally. The judgments that we have for both boys and girls are harmful. There's studies about it. There's studies that you can look at where there's this myth of this myth of the out of control boy that needs to be controlled by the girl, right? It leads to really unhealthy psychology for both boys and girls. Um, where instead we could replace that with a very mature understanding of sex and sexual desire, and how both everybody has everybody has differences, of course. There are people who are asexual out there, and that's fine too. But everybody has some level of drive. Everybody has some, parts of their brain that are adapted for that behavior. And it was just this weird thing for me when I had to leave home. I grew up in a very sort of conservative, old school area, and I went to school in the city in Boston, and it was, in the 90s, the early 90s, and it was, a culture shock for me to experience, all of the different types of relationships, but then to start dating, um, I had been, I had been dated. I dated somebody all through high school, um, and we were intimate, but just to discover like well, the different attitudes towards sex and sexual behavior, because there were people from different parts of the country. There were people from different countries, in my college, and I was in the city, and it was a crazy time in the city. It was really before a lot of gentrification. I remember I lived, if you don't know Boston, this won't mean much to you, but I can describe it a little bit. I lived in a place near a place called Kenmore Square. Kenmore Square is near where the Boston Red Sox play, the baseball team, and was a crazy place back then. There were like literally basement clubs where a lot of punk bands were playing. There were like used record stores. It was really like this kind of student mecca, people playing music out on the street, all this stuff. Now it's like, $4 million condos and all that stuff there. Very, very different place than when I moved there in 1990. So I was exposed to quite a lot of stuff all of a sudden. It was really interesting, and travel helped that as well. I remember when I was 17, going to Europe for the first time, and walked into it was in a hotel in Germany, and walked into a sauna in the hotel, and everybody was naked. Everybody, grandma down to the kids, men, women, all ages, just sitting there taking a steam. And I walked in my bathing suit, and I was the odd one out. Yeah, yeah. Um, yeah, I think it is interesting. We rely really heavily on our symbols, right? So our labels. Even my name is a label. My title, if I say I'm a spiritual teacher, or if I say I'm a dad, right, those are labels. But labels are also limitations, to your point. When I look at somebody and say, oh, you know that is an Italian man, like that is like trying really putting somebody in a box, or that is a gay person, or that is a this kind of person. It's putting somebody in a conceptual box. Um, I do think, though, that as far as people sort of owning their labels, right? Um, I can understand the aspect of coming from a time where it was shameful, potentially illegal, potentially life threatening to be like a gay man, right? When I was a kid, there was a murder. I grew up in Maine. Live in Maine now. There was a murder that happened in Bangor, Maine, of a young man because he was gay. He was taken out and killed by a group of men. Um, and part of that was the impetus for Stephen King to write the book It, right? Um, when Stephen King writes about Derry, Maine, it's actually Bangor. So, like, I can understand from one perspective, like, taking back a label, like, feeling empowered by being, out, essentially. Um, yeah, I get it. And I do think, like, th there's a point to dividing people by labels. But I not having come from not having come from that personally, where my life was potentially at risk for identifying my sexuality, or being excluded or whatever. There's something maybe empowering about owning a label that was used to oppress people for a really long time. I don't know. I can't speak for others. I can only speak for myself. Um, Labels are self-applied, whereas back then labels were applied by you and others. Yeah. Um, yeah. So it's a good point. It's right. So I can apply a label to myself, right? And that's much more empowering than if decide that you're going to label me somehow. Um, yeah, I think that's really different. Um, That's a good point. Um, yeah, and I always sign off with, if you stay with me to the end, I always sign off with "I love you guys," and I actually mean that. Like, love. We have such a limited view of love. The English language is so limited in respect to talking about love. I read once that Persian had 85 different words for love, and it's like that in other cultures as well, where there are different words for love, and we have one. We have the word love, um, and it means so many different things that it can be very confusing, right? Um, you can say "I love you" to somebody, it can become very awkward really quickly. Um, but it was funny because I went to a high school graduation a couple weeks ago, and the principal of the high school was speaking on stage, and he signed off with "I love you guys," right? And so somebody was like, "Did he just say I love you?" Like that was like, yeah, he did. He loves his students, and I think that's great. We're not talking about romantic love. We're not talking about sexual attraction. We're talking about love as acceptance, as really having, holding people in allowing them to be who they are. Um, yeah, yeah, it is. It's interesting. Allow people to call themselves what they want. I struggle with in my teaching tradition. So, most people who know me or tune in know that I teach and practice shamanism. I do not refer to myself as a shaman. It's not a label in my tradition. It's not a label one can apply to themselves. There's a rule, there's a taboo about it. Um, However, people have asked me, "Can I call you my shaman?" And I'm like, "You can call me whatever you want. That's fine." My friends, friends, they're like, "Can we say that you're our shaman?" I'm like, "You can say that I'm your hairdresser if you want." I don't, but it's fine. It's fine if somebody else uses that label. The idea is that I'm not allowed to self label that. I struggle with that a little bit because, like, I don't care about wearing that particular label, but to me, that's dogma. And I was taught to believe that shamanism doesn't have dogma, but um, it's interesting. Oh, thank you. Oh, yeah. I hopefully, and there's always food for thought for me as well. Like, everybody's comments, um, make me think. So I know you have to disappear. You're working this morning, so I appreciate you joining again, as usual. And everybody's contributions are usually, really helpful and good, and give me food for thought. And I learn things from everybody. So it's just a wonderful thing. Um, yeah. So I mean, labels. I can't. I'm. Tech was taught not to self-apply the label of shaman, which I'm fine with. I don't. I will refer to myself as a shamanic practitioner or a teacher, but I don't use that word to myself. And some people do. Some people call themselves shamans, and that's fine too. There's a guy, I don't know him and I don't know his teaching that well. He seems like a nice guy from what I've seen, that refers to himself as Shaman Durek. He wrote a book about shamanism. I haven't read it, so I can't speak to his teaching or anything, but um, I don't have a problem with that just because and here's where this comes in, just because my teaching lineage says you cannot put the label of shaman on yourself. You cannot call yourself a shaman. That doesn't mean I can judge that person for using that label, because undoubtedly he came from a different lineage than I did. And that might not be a thing. So, there's this whole live and let live thing. I don't have to critique other people for doing what they do. Oh, branding. Yeah, when you're selling yourself, isn't it more like branding rather than labeling? Yeah, you're working as well. Um, yeah, I mean, so yeah, so to an extent, right? If I refer to myself as a shaman or a shamanic practitioner or something, that is a type of branding. Um, right? I'm saying, people come to me for shamanism. Branding is about differentiating yourself, right? Like, you can recognize, it doesn't matter what country in the world you're in, what language, and what alphabet they use. Anybody can recognize a bottle of Coca-Cola, right? Because it has that really unique, distinct shape. It's part of their branding. It's part of their marketing. I remember I taught actually have an MBA in marketing, and I went and guest lectured at this college nearby and did a talk on marketing and positioning. And I had slides and I projected a Coca-Cola bottle from Japan. So like the label Coca-Cola was not in English, Japanese. And I said, "Who know what is this?" And I'm like, everybody obviously knew it was a Coca-Cola bottle, right? Like, "Oh, that's Coca-Cola." And I'm like, "Does anybody in here read Japanese?" Nobody raised their hand. Like, how do you know? How do you know that's Coca-Cola? Oh, it's the shape of the bottle. They know what they're getting. And that's a little bit about what branding is. And branding and spirituality can be a little hinky, I guess. One does not want to brag or be show a lot of hubris or be haughty or those kinds of things. But you still have to let people know what you do. Right. So if somebody, like, I don't do Reiki, for example, I don't do Reiki healing. So if I just said, "I'm John, I do spiritual healing," and somebody came to me expecting Reiki practice or something, um, I don't, I couldn't do I couldn't do that. So part of that is to differentiate myself. Um, Sitting on the sidewalk waiting for a ride. Oh my gosh. Oh yeah. um, yeah. I don't mean to be. I'm not trying to be political or anything. I realize that sometimes, the idea of gender gets really into politics these days. People will talk about gender politics, but it doesn't have to be political. It's just that politicians have sort of latched on to um, identity issues, right? So we're talking about identity, whether you're talking about labeling or branding or, um, you know, and who gets to decide what your identity is, or if your identity is okay, or if you get to, um, if you get to, uh, reject somebody because of their identity, right? So, um, you know, I'm assuming that most people watching this see me as male. I am male. I identify as male. I'm, happen to be cisgendered. I was born a male. Um, but if who know if I appeared in a different time, you know, we'll say, to take an extreme example, right? Um, let's take like 18th century France, pre-revolution, French society. um, I would be rejected based on my appearance, right? I'm not wearing a wig. I'm not wearing a powdered wig. I'm not wearing makeup. I'm not wearing, clothing, breeches and a cloak, and whatever the dress at the time was, right? I don't know how I don't know how modern dress would be, or modern appearance would be perceived, but this is not how people presented themselves. I mean, maybe I would be perceived as a peasant or something, I don't know. Or short hair, maybe they would think I was a monk or something. I don't know. Or just think I was weird, which is fine too. I am pretty weird, so it's okay. Um, so I do have to wrap in a few minutes. Been talking for about an hour, and I do want to thank everybody for contributing. This has been a um, great conversation. Lots to think about. Um, so yeah, so labels. Labels are a thing people choose. Like I don't, you know, people do label their sexuality very often. I think as a way of communicating. Yeah, fashion for all genders is pretty wacky. Um, y- y- I always thought it was really weird how we put, traditionally, and I don't think this was always the case. We put boys in blue and girls in pink. Who said that pink means girls and blue means boys, and why? Like, what does that have to do with anything? And why do we have to color code our children, when they're babies? Who cares? People would always ask, do you have a boy or a girl? There are all these, gender reveal parties and all of these things. I get it. I mean, I did when I found out. I have twin daughters. When I found out we were having twins, I did I did want to know the gender, but it wouldn't have mattered to me, you know. Um uh and people were very particular. Oh, how are you going to dress your girls? You have two girls. You can't put them both in pink. You can't put them both in purple. I'm like, well, one day she'll wear brown, and one day she'll wear red, and one day she'll wear purple. And if it's really hard for you, we'll put them in different colors. Yeah, yes, absolutely. They can sell more. Um, and boys and girls toys, right? So my daughters, when they were little, they didn't go to preschool till they were almost 3. They were premature. They were born prematurely, so their doctor was like, keep them out of preschool as long as you can. It's an immune system thing, and they had at home they played with blocks and trucks and dolls, and there was no like whatever toys they liked, they just played with. And then I remember them coming home from preschool when they were 3, and pick up a truck or something, and they used to love to play with toy trucks and toy cars. I'm like, oh, you want to play with this? And my daughter looks at me and goes, I can't play with that, it's a boy's toy. And I was like, who said that to you? And it was some kid, right? It was some kid in the class said, oh, you can't play with that, it's that trucks are for boys and dolls are for girls. And, you know, why can't girls enjoy trucks and boys can enjoy dolls? I love taking care of my daughters. I love babies. I love, all of those things. I probably, I had my closest cousin who lived next door to me when I was really young, and age was female. So I probably played with dolls with her when until I was about 4 or 5 and moved away from them. I mean, my dad wouldn't let me play with dolls, that's for sure. We didn't have dolls, we had action figures, right? We had GI Joe, and they couldn't call them dolls, they had to call them action figures for boys to play with them. But yeah, you can sell twice as much stuff if you separate. It's a good point, if you separate stuff out. um kids clothes and stuff like that. But it's just funny. Their experience, speaking of which, before I go, I will leave with one last thing. There are experiments, there are really good ones there. You can watch videos of this going on, where they take a young child, like toddler age, like 18 months or something. Same toddler, right? I can't remember if it was a little boy or a little girl, but you can't really tell. There aren't secondary sex characteristics yet. Nobody's growing a beard, or anything yet. So this they would dress this child up, same child, alternately in stereotypical boy clothes or stereotypical girl clothes, and then have somebody who was like a daycare worker or somebody come in and just play with the child. And there was a group of toys around, of all different kinds of toys around, and they just observed and they just videotaped. When this toddler was dressed as a boy, the day school daycare teacher would pick up the trucks and go, oh, and the play would be very active, and they'd be playing with the trucks and whatever. And when the same toddler was dressed as a girl, the daycare workers would pick up a doll and do much more quiet, much more gentle play. And most of that's unconscious. Most of that is not uh people aren't thinking about that. We just do. Culture has a normative force, right? Culture tries to get us to conform to this very limited model that we fit into. But the reality is, most of us don't fit into the predominant culture that well. Most people have outside things. We can force ourselves by repressing parts of ourselves. Um, but we're very limited when we do that. We're very, this isn't to say that culture doesn't have its positive intention. Everything, there's a positive intention behind everything, right? One of the reasons for culture having this normalizing force is so that tribal groups can live together in better harmony and do things like cooperative hunting or whatever. Um, we all have expectations and understanding. Um, yes, autism. Yeah, we're learning that autism is just as prevalent in girls, and it shows up really differently. You know, somebody convinced me when my daughters were young to have them tested for autism, and I was like, they don't behave, my understanding of, autism, they don't behave that way. And they're like, yeah, it doesn't show up that way in girls. The social skills aren't as impacted and things like that. Um, we did get them tested, took them for neuropsychological testing, and turns out they were not on the spectrum. But uh, yeah, it's interesting, and a lot of women. I've read things of women not getting diagnosed until they're 30, even sometimes much older than that, or never getting diagnosed. But it turns out that it is pretty much just as prevalent. Yeah, Yeah, we definitely everybody's conditioned, pretty much unaware. Like culture, I talk about culture like a fish swimming through the ocean, right? Fish is not really necessarily aware that they're swimming through water. They're just existing. Or we're not always aware of the atmosphere that we're in, right? That there's a certain amount of pressure bearing down on us from the weight of the air that we're in. We don't often feel that unless we go up high in the mountains or we go underwater where the water's weighing down us too. But we exist on it and it does exert a pressure on us. Um, Culture exerts pressure on us and most of it's unconscious. We see it in the way that uh, stuff is expressed in the media, right? Gender roles are expressed in the media, or sex is presented in the media, or um, media is an out, is a cultural artifact. And you look at it, we still have, we are. Here's a good example. Some time ago, a few years back, we were looking to adopt a cat. Got a from a rescue. And there was this black cat, very pretty cat, with like a white stripe on his um, chest, and really cool facial features. And we adopted him, and the foster place was like, "Oh, thank you for adopting him. We were really worried he was going to be sticking around for a while." And I'm like, "Well, why?" And they're like, "Black cats don't get adopted." Really? Like, the whole thing with black cats being bad luck and not getting adopted, like today in this day and age, is because they were associated with witches in the Middle Ages. So, you know, 500 years ago, 600 years ago, we associated black cats with witches. And today, they don't get adopted. This but people don't think about that. They're just like, "Oh, I don't want a black cat." This is how culture shapes our behavior without us even knowing about it. And I think what we need to do is to become more aware of the cultural forces that shape our attitudes, beliefs, behaviors, and values, right? So we can understand what's real, what's BS. We can make our own choices about what is right for us. You know, a lot of the stuff we're talking about, like labels and the way that people feel like they have to dress or appear or speak or body image, all of this stuff is from pressure from culture to conform to cultural norms, which is really hard because we're all individuals. We all have things that might not be normative in this culture. I've embraced weird. I'm a weirdo and I like that. Speaking of labels, I will apply that label to myself. If somebody else calls me a weirdo, I probably wouldn't. I mean, wouldn't get offended these days, but there was a time where somebody's like, "You're really weird." How dare you? Nowadays, somebody says you're really weird. I'm like, "Oh, you noticed, huh? What was your first clue about that?" So, anyway, I will leave with this message. Yeah, a lot of what is perceived as real is, yeah, everything is, um, we live in normal is very boring. Yeah, for sure. Um, we all live in reality tunnels. We all live in this within a paradigm, right? And anything outside of that is hard to understand, or we ignore it, or we label it as aberrant or whatever. But the thing to realize is every single person is in their own little reality tunnel. Every person's reality is completely different. There may be some consensus. There may be some places where our reality overlaps. Um, but there may be some places where it doesn't. There are places where it doesn't. So anyway, I have got to run. I'm a little bit over time here today. Thank you all again for joining me. I do love you all. I mean that. I'm so grateful that you all join. I'm so grateful for the comments and conversation. Everything's been, thought provoking and, you know, food for thought, as we say. Thank you as well. Have a very good Friday. Enjoy your weekend. Thank you. Thank you. Enjoy your weekend, and I will talk to you all very soon.